Her mother had been dead for 16 months, and somehow she had still managed to leave a warning. 2 sentences, hidden behind a false panel, in a drawer someone had already broken into before Claire ever arrived. She stood in that kitchen at midnight, holding a piece of paper that smelled like cedar and old ink, and read her mother's handwriting one more time. If Richard ever tells you I was against you, don't believe him. The scratches on the brass lock were fresh, not days old, weeks maybe. Someone had been here, searched, left without finding what they came for. But they would come back. She looked at the dark shape of the lake through the yellow curtains. Somewhere in this house was something worth breaking in for, and she had no idea yet how far someone would go to make sure she never found it. Claire Ashford drove north for 6 hours without the radio on. Not because she forgot to turn it on, because she didn't want anything filling the silence. The silence was the only thing left that belonged to her. She had $423 in her checking account, 1 suitcase in the back seat, and a manila envelope on the passenger seat that she hadn't opened since the courthouse steps. She knew what was inside. She'd watched the clerk slide each page across the table. She'd signed where the attorney pointed. She just couldn't look at it again. Not yet. The November sky over Michigan pressed down flat and gray. The kind of gray that isn't coming. It's already here. Has been here for a while. She passed the same lake towns she'd driven through as a girl. The bait shops and the gas stations and the Lutheran churches with their low white signs, and none of it looked the way she remembered. Or maybe it did. Maybe she was the one who'd changed and couldn't tell the difference anymore. 11 years. That's how long she'd been Claire Ashford instead of Claire Calloway. 11 years of joint accounts and shared calendars, and a kitchen in a house in Ann Arbor where she'd made coffee every decided, somewhere around year 4, that her name on a document was more useful to him than her opinion about anything. She hadn't known that then. She knew it now. The sign for Dunmore Lake appeared in her headlights. Population 1,140. She took the turnoff without slowing down. The road narrowed. Trees crowded in from both sides. Gravel replaced asphalt. Then gravel gave way to the packed dirt lane that wound along the eastern edge of the lake. She'd ridden her bicycle down this lane every summer until she was 16. She knew every curve of it. She just hadn't been back in almost 2 years. Not since her mother's hip surgery. Not since the last visit that ended with both of them saying something they couldn't take back. The cottage came into view through a gap in the pines. She stopped the car, sat there with the engine running and the headlights cutting across the front porch and the yellow kitchen curtains that her mother had sewn herself from fabric she'd bought at the mill outlet on Route 9. Marge Calloway had sewn those curtains in 1987. They were still there. Claire turned off the engine. Dark. Just the sound of the lake moving and the wind in the pine needles and her own breathing. She picked up the envelope from the passenger seat, turned it over once. Then she noticed something she hadn't noticed at the courthouse, something she'd missed in the parking lot and on the highway, and during all 6 hours of silence. A corner of it was already open. Not torn, not damaged, just open, like someone had peeled back the flap carefully and then pressed it shut again without quite meaning it. She set it back down, looked at the cottage, went inside. The cold hit her before the dark did. Not the cold of a house left empty overnight. The cold of a house that hasn't had anyone in it for a long time. 16 months. That's how long it had been since Marge died. 16 months since the neighbor had called, and Claire had driven up alone, and Richard had arrived the next morning with a pressed shirt and his reading glasses, and a look on his face that said he was already calculating what this meant for their financial year. She didn't let herself think about that. She found the light switch by feel. The overhead lamp in the kitchen flickered and steadied. The room looked exactly the way Marge had left it. The wooden table with the gouge in the corner, from when Claire's father dropped a cast iron skillet in 1994. The same 4 chairs. The same blue ceramic cookie jar shaped like a barn that had never, in Claire's entire memory, contained a single cookie. The same dish towel hanging from the oven handle, white with red stripes, slightly frayed on one end. And there, on the hook beside the back door, Marge's gray cardigan. The one she wore every morning from September through May. the one with the pocket where she kept her reading glasses and a folded piece of paper that was always a grocery list, but sometimes, when Claire was small, was a note to herself that she'd never let anyone read. Claire stood in the doorway and looked at that cardigan for a long time. She did not touch it. She set her suitcase down by the stairs instead, walked through to the living room and opened the fireplace damper, and found a half-full box of matches on the mantel exactly where her mother had kept matches for 60 years. She got a fire going with the wood stacked in the iron holder and crouched in front of it, with her coat still on, until the shaking in her hands had nothing to do with the cold anymore. She hadn't eaten since the gas station outside of Flint. She found a can of tomato soup in the pantry, which meant the pantry was otherwise empty, which meant she'd be making a grocery run in the morning, which meant she needed to think about money, which she could not think about right now. She heated the soup on the stove, ate it standing at the counter, and looked out through the yellow curtains at the dark shape of the lake. There were nights when the lake was beautiful. This was not one of them. This was just water, dark and cold and going nowhere. She was about to rinse the bowl when she noticed the desk. Her mother's writing desk. Oak. Old. The one that had sat against the wall between the living room and the small hallway for as long as Claire could remember. Marge used it to pay bills, write letters, and keep what she called her household records, in a way that no one else was allowed to touch. The top left drawer was slightly open. Claire crossed the room slowly. The drawer pulled out stiff, the way drawers in old furniture do when the wood has swelled and dried through too many seasons. She yanked once and it came free, and she stood there looking at what was inside. Almost nothing. An old utility bill. A box of paper clips. A dried-up pen. But the wood around the lock was wrong. She saw it immediately. The brass plate was scratched. Not the small scratches that come from years of normal use. These were fresh, concentrated. The kind of scratches that come from something being inserted where it wasn't supposed to go. Someone had forced this drawer. She touched the edge of the scratches with one finger. They caught on her skin the way new metal always does. There was no dust in the scratches. Everything else in this house had a film of dust that 16 months of emptiness will leave on every surface. But these scratches were clean, recent. She opened the drawer all the way and lifted out the utility bill. Underneath it, folded against the back corner, was a yellow envelope. The kind that office supply stores used to sell in bulk. Her mother had kept them in a drawer in the kitchen, a whole stack, for writing checks and mailing birthday cards. Claire pulled it out and unfolded it. A tax notice. She read it once, then again. The property taxes on the cottage were delinquent, not by a small amount. Penalties had compounded over 2 billing cycles. If the balance wasn't resolved within 30 days of formal notice, the county could move toward a lien, and eventually a forced sale. She sat down in her mother's desk chair. The number at the bottom of the notice was not a number that 423 could touch. She almost laughed. She felt it coming up the way laughter sometimes does when things have gotten so bad that the only other option is to lie down on the floor and stay there. She pressed her fingers against her eyes instead. Okay. She could call Adrienne in the morning. Adrienne Solt, the attorney who had handled her divorce, with the careful, methodical energy of someone who had seen every kind of disaster and learned to triage. Adrienne would know about payment plans. Adrienne would know about options. There were always options. She was still sitting there, still holding the tax notice, when she saw the other thing. The drawer was shallower than it should have been. She'd sat at this desk 100 times as a girl, watching her mother pay bills and write letters and sort papers. She knew the shape of this drawer, and this was not it. She pulled the drawer completely free of the desk, turned it over. The bottom of the drawer was thin pine, like all old drawer bottoms. But behind where the drawer had been sitting was not the back wall of the desk. It was a panel, a thin one, fitted carefully. You wouldn't notice unless you were looking. She pressed the left corner. It shifted. A narrow space behind it, maybe 4 inches deep, just wide enough for documents. Inside, a small brass key on a loop of blue ribbon, and a folded piece of paper. She recognized the handwriting before she could even read the words. The particular slope of the letters, the way her mother always pressed too hard with a pen, leaving impressions in whatever was beneath. Her fingers went still. She unfolded it. 2 sentences. If Richard ever tells you I was against you, don't believe him. Start with the blue ledger. She read it 3 times. Then she set it flat on the desk and put her palms down on either side of it and breathed. Richard, not your husband. Not if something goes wrong. Not a general warning. Richard. Her mother had written his name specifically, in a note hidden behind a false panel in a locked drawer that someone had forced open before Claire ever got here. She looked at the scratches on the brass plate again. Someone had been here first. She didn't sleep well. She lay on top of the covers in the small bedroom that had been her room growing up, still wearing her clothes, the brass key on the ribbon sitting on the nightstand where she could see it. The fire in the living room burned down to coals. The lake made its sounds. Wind, water, the occasional knock of something against the old dock pilings. She kept thinking about the scratches. Not fresh from last week, not from years ago, somewhere in between. The dust patterns in the drawer told her at least that much. When she'd pulled the drawer free, the dust had been undisturbed on the bottom corners, where the drawer runners sat. But the lock plate itself had no dust at all. Recently forced, but not in the last few days. Someone had been here, searched, not found what they were looking for, and left. And then either before or after, someone else had found the note and the key and left those behind. Or someone had left them there before anyone came searching. She was going in circles. She gave up on sleep around 6 and made coffee from a can of grounds she found in the back of a cabinet. The coffee was old enough to taste like the idea of coffee rather than coffee itself. She drank it anyway, standing at the kitchen window, watching the light come back over the lake. Gray, then silver, then a pale, washed-out blue that didn't commit to anything. She had a list to make. She was good at lists. 11 years of managing a household on an allowance that was technically joint money, but practically Richard's decision, had made her very good at lists. At finding efficiencies. At making things work on whatever margin she was given, without making it obvious that the margin was thin. She found a notepad in the kitchen drawer, the same drawer where Marge had kept notepads for 40 years, and she sat down at the table and wrote, "Call Adrienne. Property tax situation. Call county office, confirm timeline. Find blue ledger. Find out who was in this house." She looked at the list for a while, crossed out the last line and rewrote it below the others. Then she added one more. Find out what Marge knew about Richard. Because that was the real question. That was what kept her awake. Not the tax notice. Not the forced drawer. Not the scratches on the brass plate. That her mother, who had expressed her disapproval of Richard Ashford, exactly once, in exactly these words, standing in this kitchen in September of 2016, "Claire, I just want to make sure you're happy," and then had said nothing more. When Claire told her she was fine, "Thank you, please drop it." Her mother had apparently been doing something other than dropping it, had apparently been watching, recording, hiding things where someone might need to find them. Her mother, who never asked twice about anything after the first rebuff. Her mother, who Claire had understood to mean that she disapproved but had accepted. Her mother, who had apparently kept a ledger. What was in it? She needed to know who had been in this house. There was only one person who might know. Cecile Hartwood lived a quarter-mile down the lake road in a white house with dark green shutters that was the same size as Marge's cottage, but felt somehow sturdier, like whoever built it had meant it to last. Cecile had lived there for 31 years. She was 72. She'd worked as secretary to 3 successive county clerks over a career that spanned nearly 3 decades, which meant she knew more about how Dunmore County actually functioned than most people who'd spent their lives in it. Claire had known her peripherally for years. The way you know your parents' closest neighbor. You wave. You make small talk at the hardware store. You attend the same funeral and sit 2 rows apart. You don't actually know each other. She walked down the road at 8 o'clock in the morning because calling ahead felt wrong. Because if she had time to think about it, she wouldn't go. Cecile opened the door before Claire reached the porch steps. She stood in the doorway in a quilted vest and a pair of reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, looking at Claire with the expression of someone who is not surprised, but also not pleased. "You came back," she said. "Yes. It took you a while." Claire stopped at the bottom of the steps. The air between them was very still. "It did," she said. I know it did. I'm not going to make excuses for that. Cecile looked at her for a moment longer. Then she stepped back. Come in. The kitchen smelled like coffee, and something with cinnamon in it. Real coffee, not the ghost of coffee. Cecile poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the table. She didn't offer milk or sugar. Claire didn't ask for either. You went in the cottage, Cecile said. It wasn't a question. Last night. How is it? Cold. The pantry's empty. The property taxes are badly behind. Cecile wrapped her hands around her mug. Her knuckles were the kind that had worked hard for a long time. Your mother didn't tell you. She didn't tell me a lot of things, apparently. Cecile looked out the window. She protected people. It was the thing she did. Even when they didn't ask her to. Even when they needed something other than protection. Claire didn't say anything. She was angry with you, Cecile said. Near the end. You should know that. She understood why you weren't here as much as she wanted. She didn't like it, but she understood. The anger was separate from that. What was the anger about? She couldn't tell you something she'd found out, and she couldn't figure out how to make you listen without you thinking she was interfering. Cecile set down her mug. That was a particular agony for her. Claire felt something tighten in her chest. Found out what? That I can't tell you. Because I don't know what she found. I only know what I saw. Then tell me what you saw. Cecile looked at her directly. Her eyes were pale gray and very clear, and they didn't waver. About a year before she died, Cecile said, a man came to the cottage. I didn't recognize him. 60-something. Drove a gray sedan with a dent in the front passenger door. He had a briefcase, the old kind, the hard kind. He was there for about 40 minutes, and when he left without the briefcase. Claire's coffee cup stopped halfway to her mouth. He left it there. Or left something in it there. I saw him carry it in. I didn't see him carry it out. Cecile paused. Your mother called me that evening. I asked her how she was doing, standard call. She sounded different than usual. Not upset. Settled was the word I'd use. Like someone who's been waiting for a test result and finally got it. She looked down. She said, now I know how much time I have. I thought at first she meant her health. She'd been having some heart episodes. But later, I thought maybe she didn't mean that at all. Claire waited. 3 weeks after that, Cecile said, your husband came. The kitchen went quiet. I know what he looks like, Cecile continued. I'd met him twice. Once when you both came up for your mother's birthday in 19, and once at the funeral. He came alone. Told me he was collecting some family documents on your behalf. She watched Claire's face. He was inside for nearly 3 hours. When he came out, he was carrying a cardboard box, maybe this big. She held her hands about 18 inches apart. And he was angry. I could see it from my front window. He put the box in the trunk and he got in the car, and he sat there for a few minutes before he drove away. What was he angry about? Claire said. I think, Cecile said carefully, that he didn't find what he came looking for. Silence. The coffee cooled in both their mugs. I never told you about him, Cecile said. I want you to understand why. Why? Because I didn't know what it meant. I still don't know exactly what it meant. I'm a careful person. I don't report things I don't understand. If I'd been wrong about Richard, and he had in fact been there on your behalf, and you'd found out I'd called you to tell you he'd been in your mother's house cleaning out her papers, it would have seemed like exactly the kind of busybody neighbor gossip that gets people into trouble. She paused. I was going to wait until you came back. I figured you'd come back eventually. And if I hadn't. Cecile looked at her steadily. Your mother figured you would. Claire set her mug down. She thought about the forced drawer, the clean scratches on the lock plate, the note in her mother's handwriting. Richard. Don't believe him. There was a man, she said slowly. The one who came first. With the briefcase, did you catch a name? Cecile thought. He didn't introduce himself to me, but your mother mentioned him once. A few weeks later. Said she'd been working with an auditor. She used the word auditor specifically. I remember it because I thought it was an odd word to volunteer. She paused. She used a first name. Owen, I think. Owen something. She said he was thorough. Owen. Claire looked at the table. Something was assembling itself in her mind. Slowly, the way a picture comes together when you're looking at it from too close, and keep having to step back. Her mother hadn't just left a note. Her mother had left a system. She stayed at Cecile's for another hour. They talked about Marge the way you talk about someone when you've both been avoiding it and have finally run out of reasons to avoid it. Cecile told her about the last months, the heart medication, the oxygen concentrator that Cecile had helped Marge figure out in October, the good days and the days that weren't, the way Marge had insisted on coming to sit on Cecile's porch every Sunday evening until she physically could not anymore, the way she'd wanted to talk about specific things on those evenings, her recipes, the history of the property, her late husband, Claire's father who had been dead 22 years, old decisions, old silences. She wanted to be remembered accurately, Cecile said. That was what those conversations felt like. She was trying to make sure someone knew the accurate version. Claire walked back to the cottage in the sharp cold of late morning. The lake was pewter and flat. A pair of mergansers sat on the surface about 50 yards out, not moving, just existing in the way birds exist when they're not doing anything in particular and don't feel the need to apologize for it. She stood on the shore for a moment. Richard had been in this house. He had told Cecile he was there on Claire's behalf. He had been here at some point after Marge's death, which meant after September of last year, and the divorce proceedings had been filed the previous spring, and the final hearing had been in August, so he had come here either during the proceedings or after the judgment, both of which were times when any reasonable attorney would have told him to stay far away from his ex-wife's family property, which meant he hadn't consulted an attorney before coming, or he had consulted one and come anyway. She went inside and stood in front of the desk again. She pulled the drawer out completely, lifted it off the runners and turned it over, studying the false panel she'd found the night before. The panel fit cleanly, but there were small indentations on one side, the left side, where something had been inserted and pried. These marks were different from the lock plate scratches. Older, dustier, predating the lock plate marks by what looked like a significant margin. 2 events. 2 separate entries into this desk. Someone had found the hidden panel first. Whether they'd taken what was inside, or found it empty, or simply not looked carefully enough, she couldn't tell. And then someone had forced the lock later, probably Richard, and found only what was left. The utility bill, the paper clips, the dried-up pen, the yellow envelope with the tax notice which he might have taken or might have left, because he didn't recognize its significance. And the note and the key were gone, or had never been there to begin with. Except she'd found them last night. They were on the nightstand upstairs, so whoever came first hadn't found them either. She thought about the man with the briefcase. Owen, the auditor. She went upstairs and picked up the note again. Read it twice more. Then she looked at the brass key on its blue ribbon. A key this small opened a lockbox. Maybe a safe deposit box, maybe a trunk or a strong box. Not a room. Not a door. She walked through the cottage methodically. Her mother had not been a woman who hid things randomly. She hid things with intention. There was always a logic to where things were, a logic you could follow once you understood how Marge's mind had worked. Everything in its category. Everything in a place that made a kind of sense. Strongbox. Lockbox. Something you'd secure. The attic was mostly empty. A few boxes of her father's things, furniture covered in old sheets. No lockbox. The bedroom closet. The space under the bathroom sink. A basket on the upper kitchen shelf. Nothing. She stood in the kitchen and thought. Her mother's household records. Her mother had kept things related to the house in the desk, but things she really wanted kept safe, valuables, her late husband's watch, the good camera from the 80s, the certificates from the town savings bonds she'd bought through the 1990s. Those had always gone in the old cedar chest in the corner of the master bedroom. Claire went to the master bedroom. The cedar chest sat where it had always sat, at the foot of the bed, dark with age. The brass latch was locked, which it hadn't always been. She'd seen it open plenty of times over the years, Marge lifting the lid to pull out a sweater or a box of photographs, but now it was locked. She took the brass key from the nightstand. It fit. The chest opened with the smell of cedar and old fabric. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked inside. A blue wool sweater she didn't recognize. Folded letters in rubber bands. A small photo album, the kind with the sticky pages and the plastic overlay, from somewhere in the 1980s. A cardboard box with her father's name written on the side in Marge's handwriting. Christmas cards in a rubber band. And at the bottom, beneath a folded piece of old flannel, a blue bookkeeping ledger, not large. A standard composition-style ledger, the kind with the marbled cover and the sewn binding, and the columns already printed on the pages. The kind that small businesses used before accounting software made them obsolete. Her mother's handwriting filled it from front to back. Dates, dollar amounts, notes in the margins, page after page after page. Claire sat on the edge of the bed and started reading. The earliest entries were from 2012, the year she and Richard had bought their house in Ann Arbor. The year Marge had helped with the down payment, $26,000. Claire remembered the conversation. She remembered Richard saying Marge had offered. She remembered Marge saying it was what she wanted to do. It was a gift. Don't be silly. But in the ledger it wasn't a gift. It was a loan. With a date. With the words repayable when able written in the margin and underlined twice. And below it, a schedule of payments that had never been made. That had apparently been promised and then simply not made, year after year. With notes, March 2013, no payment. August 2014, no payment. 2015, 2016, 2017. And beside each year, a single notation in Marge's increasingly cramped handwriting, asked, told everything is fine. She read for an hour without stopping. The loans totaled more than she'd thought. Marge had lent them money 3 separate times. The down payment. A lump sum in 2015 that Richard had told Claire was a short-term loan to cover a gap in his business account. Another payment in 2018 that Claire had never known about at all. An amount she'd never seen, transferred from an account in her mother's name to an account that wasn't the joint account Claire and Richard shared, but a different account entirely, with a number Claire didn't recognize. An account she'd never heard of. She set the ledger down on the bed and pressed both hands flat against the cover. There were payments going to an account she didn't know existed. 11 years of marriage and she hadn't known that account existed. Near the back of the ledger, tucked into the inside back cover, the way you might tuck a receipt into a book you want to remember, was a folded piece of paper, a photocopy. She unfolded it carefully. A bank document. A loan agreement. The name of a financial institution she recognized. The date was March 2015. The amount was $47,000, and at the bottom in the signature line, Claire M. Ashford. Her name, her middle initial, her married name. She looked at the signature for a long time. Then she got up and went to her suitcase and found her wallet and pulled out her Visa card and looked at the back of it where she'd signed her name 15 years ago in the thin, slightly forward-leaning script she'd had since college. The signature on the bank document was not her signature. It had her name. It had her initial. The letters were close. Someone had practiced. Someone had gotten reasonably good at it. But the pressure was wrong. The C was wrong. The flourish at the end of the D was something she'd never done in her life. She sat back down on the edge of the bed. Outside, the lake went on being the lake. She thought about Richard sitting in that car after he'd come out of this cottage. Sitting there for a few minutes before he drove away. Angry. Cecile's word. Angry in the way of someone who has driven a long way for something and come up short. He hadn't found the ledger. He hadn't found the photocopy. He hadn't found what her mother had hidden here. But he'd come looking for it. He'd come here, to this house, without telling Claire, after the divorce was already in motion and he'd gone through her mother's desk, and he'd left with a cardboard box of something. Papers maybe, the papers from the visible part of the drawers, the utility bills, and the receipts and the surface layer of a life. Not the hidden layer. He had known there was something to find. That meant someone had told him it existed. Or he had something to hide, and he'd been afraid the evidence of it was in this house. She looked at the photocopy again. $47,000. March 2015. That was the year Richard had started talking about investment opportunities. The year he'd moved some of their savings around. He'd explained it to her once, in a way that made her feel slow for not following it, and she'd trusted him, because he'd always handled their finances. That was the arrangement. He was better at it. He said so, and she believed him, And she'd stopped asking questions, because every time she asked questions, he made her feel like she was questioning him instead of just needing information. And there was a difference, apparently, and she'd internalized that difference, and now she was sitting on her dead mother's bed with a forged bank document in her hands. $47,000. Her name, not her signature. She pulled her phone out of her pocket and called Adrienne Solt. Adrienne picked up on the second ring. She was efficient like that. "Tell me," Adrienne said. Claire told her. All of it. The ledger, the loan entries, the account number she didn't recognize, the forged signature. She laid it out in order, the way she'd learned to do when dealing with attorneys. Just the facts, just the sequence. Save the feelings for somewhere else. When she finished, Adrienne was quiet for a moment. "Don't touch anything else without photographing it first," she said. "I know. The account number." Claire read it. "Okay." Another pause. "Claire, I need you to hear me. What you're describing isn't just divorce misconduct. What you're describing is potentially a financial crime. We need to be very careful about how we move forward. I understand. Are you safe there?" The question surprised her enough that she had to think about it. Was she safe? She was alone in a house in a town of 1,140 people on a lake in November, and she had a forged document in her hand and no money, and someone had already been in this house looking for exactly what she'd found. "I think so," she said. "Yes. For now. Don't call Richard. Don't email Richard. Don't contact him at all. I wasn't planning to. And find that auditor. The one your mother hired. If she was working with someone, that person has information you need." After the call, Claire sat in the silent bedroom for a long time. The ledger lay on the bed beside her. The photocopy still unfolded, next to it. She thought about her mother sitting at that desk, year after year, recording payments that never came, writing asking, told everything is fine beside each empty year, watching a daughter who had stopped coming around as much, who deflected questions, who had learned to perform contentment well enough to fool everyone except the one-time person who had known her since the beginning. Her mother had known. And instead of confronting Claire, or confronting Richard, or giving up entirely, had done the thing she'd always done when she believed in something that seemed unlikely. She had kept the record. She had documented it. She had hired someone named Owen to help her understand what she was looking at. And she had hidden the results somewhere her daughter would eventually find. Eventually, when she came back, which Marge had apparently been counting on. Claire stood up and went to the window. The lake was still there. It would be there in the morning, too. That was one thing about lakes. She looked at the blue ledger on the bed. Start with the blue ledger. Her mother's voice in 2 sentences on a piece of paper, from 16 months ago and further back than that. From every conversation they hadn't finished. From every visit that ended before the real thing got said. She picked up the ledger and carried it downstairs to the kitchen table. She made another cup of the bad coffee. She opened to the first page, and she started at the beginning. She read the ledger until 2 in the morning. Then she closed it, went to bed, lay there staring at the ceiling for an hour, got up and read it again. By the time gray light came through the curtains, she had read it 3 times and made 11 pages of notes in a legal pad she'd found in her mother's desk. Her handwriting got worse as the night went on. The last page was almost illegible. She didn't care, she knew what it said. The ledger was not complicated. That was the thing about it. Her mother had not been a complicated record keeper. She had been methodical and plain, and she had written things down, the way a person writes things down, when they believe that clarity is its own form of honesty. Dates on the left, amounts in the next column, a brief description, and sometimes, in the right margin, a note in slightly smaller handwriting that was less formal, less ledger-like, more like what Marge was actually thinking when she wrote the entry. The loans added up to just over $94,000 across 3 separate transfers. The down payment in 2012 Claire had known about, sort of. The $47,000 in 2015 she had not known about at all, and her signature on the document was not her signature. The third payment, $21,000 in the spring of 2018, had gone to the same unrecognized account number as the second, the same account. Not the joint account, not the household account, Not any account Claire had ever been given access to. She wrote the account number on a separate sheet of paper and put it in her coat pocket. The margin notes were what kept her awake. Most of them were straightforward. Spoke with Claire. Everything seems fine. Called twice, no answer. But there were others, dated from 2017 onward. Getting harder to reach her. She sounds tired in a way she won't explain. Asked about the Ann Arbor house, she changed the subject. And then, from January 2019, called Richard directly. He was polite. Very polite. The way someone is polite when they want you to feel you've been handled. The way someone is polite when they want you to feel you've been handled. Claire had read that line 4 times. Her mother had seen it. Whatever it was, whatever shape it had taken, Marge had seen it clearly enough to name it in the margin of a household ledger in January of 2019. And Claire, that same January, had been making coffee in Ann Arbor and telling herself she was fine. She called Adrienne at 8. "I need to talk through the account number," she said. "Good morning to you too. Sorry. Good morning. I need to talk through the account number." Adrienne's voice sharpened in the way it did when she shifted from human to attorney. "Read it to me again." Claire read it from the piece of paper in her coat pocket. "That's business account prefix," Adrienne said. "Not personal. Whoever opened it as a business entity or an LLC. Richard had a consulting arrangement. He did work on the side. He always said it was separate from our household finances because of liability reasons. Did you ever see the financials on that arrangement?" Silence, Claire. "No," she said. "He explained it once. I didn't follow it. I told him that, and he said not to worry about it." Adrienne didn't say anything for a moment, which was its own kind of answer. "We need those bank records," she said. "All of them. The account your mother transferred to, the original loan documentation, and anything you can pull from the joint accounts going back to 2012. "How do I get those?" "I file a formal discovery motion, which I was already going to do, but this accelerates things considerably." A pause. "Claire, I want to be direct with you. If that signature is not yours, we are no longer talking about an unfair divorce settlement. We are talking about fraud." The word landed in the kitchen like something dropped. Fraud. Not a bad marriage. Not financial disagreement. Not 2 people who handled money differently and couldn't reconcile their records. Fraud. A specific word with a specific legal weight that changed the shape of everything that came before it. "I know," Claire said. "I need you to photograph every page of that ledger today. Then I need you to find a local copy shop and make 2 sets of physical copies. One you keep, one you mail to my office. Priority overnight. There's no copy shop in Dunmore. Then drive to wherever the nearest one is." "Okay, and Claire," a pause. "Don't tell anyone what's in the ledger. Not a neighbor, not a friend, nobody." She didn't mention Cecile. She hadn't told Cecile what she'd found. Cecile had told her things, and she had listened, and she had thanked her and walked back down the road. That was all. "Okay," she said again. After she hung up, she sat at the kitchen table with the ledger in front of her and the legal pad beside it. The kitchen was warm. The fire she'd gotten going at 6 was still putting out heat. The yellow curtains were bright in the morning light. She thought about her mother sitting at this same table, writing checks for property taxes and electricity and the occasional repair, living on her late husband's pension and a small savings account, and whatever she'd been careful enough to put aside over 40 years of careful living, and quietly, without saying anything to anyone, sending tens of thousands of dollars to her daughter's household, to a marriage her daughter had told her not to worry about. She got up and found her phone and took photographs of every page of the ledger, front and back cover, the inside back cover where she'd found the photocopy, and the photocopy itself. Then she made coffee that was slightly better than yesterday because she'd found a newer can in a different cabinet, and poured it into a travel mug and got in the car. The copy shop was in a town called Ferris Mills, 22 minutes south. She drove there and made 2 sets of copies of every document and was back in Dunmore by 10:15. She addressed an envelope to Adrienne's office in Grand Rapids, sealed both sets of copies inside it with the original photocopy, and drove to the post office on Main Street, which was the size of a large closet and staffed by a single woman named Patrice, who had apparently been staffing it since before Claire was born. Priority, overnight to Grand Rapids. Claire said. Patrice weighed it and stamped it and looked at Claire with the frank curiosity of someone who spent most of her day talking to people from out of town. You're Marge Calloway's girl. Yes. I was sorry to hear about her. Thank you. She used to send a letter every week, whole year until she couldn't get out anymore. Her neighbor drove her in. A pause. Always to the same address. Grand Rapids. Claire looked up from her wallet. Do you remember what name? Patrice considered this with the expression of someone who categorically does not share other people's mail information, but is deciding whether this particular situation counts as other people. It had a business name on it. Something Audit, Pratt something, or something Pratt. I can't say for certain. Owen Pratt. Her mother had been sending letters to Owen Pratt in Grand Rapids for an entire year. She paid for the envelope and walked out into the thin November sunshine and stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Owen Pratt, Grand Rapids. The man with the briefcase and the gray sedan with the dented passenger door, who had left something for Marge and whom Marge had described as thorough. She had a name. She needed an address, or a phone number. She got back in the car and called Cecile. The man who came before Richard, she said. You mentioned a name, Owen. Do you remember anything else about him? A last name. What the car looked like. Cecile thought. He had a briefcase, the hard-sided kind. Dark gray sedan. There was damage on the front passenger panel. And I believe there was a business card. He may have given one. To your mother. She might have left it somewhere. Claire thought about the desk. She'd gone through it thoroughly. But she hadn't gone through everywhere. Did you ever see a card in the house? I don't think so. But I wasn't in the house often after she got sick. After the call, Claire went back to the cottage and looked. Not the desk this time. She thought about where Marge put cards and phone numbers. Not in the desk. The desk was for bills and formal correspondence. Phone numbers went on the pad beside the telephone. The old telephone that still sat on the small table in the hall. A pale yellow landline that had been there since roughly 1993, and still worked because Marge had never seen a reason to disconnect it. Beside it, on a pad attached to the wall with a thumbtack, was a column of numbers in her mother's handwriting. Dr. Plumber, Cecile, Dentist, County Tax Office, Library, and at the bottom, written in slightly darker ink, like it had been added later, O. Pratt, followed by a Grand Rapids area code and 7 digits. She called it. It rang 4 times. Then a voicemail, a man's voice, professional and unhurried. You've reached Owen Pratt. Leave a message and a number and I'll get back to you within the day. She left a message. Her name, her number. The fact that she was Marge Calloway's daughter and that she had found the blue ledger and she needed to speak with him. Then she hung up and waited. She photographed the phone pad. She photographed the ledger again from a different angle to make sure the pages were legible. She made herself eat something. She made herself crackers and peanut butter she'd found in the cabinet, and then she sat at the kitchen table and went through the ledger one more time looking for anything she'd missed. There was a notation on page 43 she'd skimmed past the night before. February 2020. In the right margin, smaller than the other notes. Spoke with O.P. He confirmed 3 documents, possibly more. She won't like knowing this, but she needs to know. She won't like knowing this, but she needs to know. Claire put the ledger down. She needs to know. Not Claire had to be told. Not my daughter needs to understand. Just, she needs to know. Simple. Certain. The phrasing of someone who has made a decision after a long time of not making it. Her phone rang 40 minutes later. Grand Rapids area code. Ms. Ashford, said the voice from the voicemail. Steady. The voice of a man who spent his career dealing with numbers that told uncomfortable truths, and had made his peace with that, Mr. Pratt. I wondered when you'd call. I'm sorry for your loss. Your mother was a very determined woman. She was. Claire paused. How long were you working with her? 14 months. Starting when? She contacted me in the fall of the year before she died. A mutual acquaintance referred her. She had found some inconsistencies in her household records and wanted a professional opinion. What kind of inconsistencies? The kind, he said carefully, that suggested her son-in-law had been using her generosity to finance things she hadn't been told about. Claire gripped the phone tighter. She sent me documents over time, he continued. Copies of correspondence, bank statements she had records of, the loan agreements she'd kept. I helped her understand what she was looking at and helped her organize what she already had. Did you know about the forged signature? A pause. I suspected. I couldn't confirm without access to the original documents. But the loan in 2015 had characteristics that were inconsistent with your mother's account of how it was arranged. She didn't know about it, Claire said. The transfer went to an account I've never seen. She sent money to an account my husband apparently had that I knew nothing about. Yes. Quiet. Not surprised quiet. Confirming quiet. That's consistent with what I was looking at. She got up and walked to the kitchen window because she needed something to look at while she was having this conversation, and the lake was there, and it was better than the wall. The briefcase, she said, when you came to see her. Cecile Hartwood saw you leave it. I left her copies of the analysis I'd done, and a set of recommendations for next steps. She wanted physical copies, not digital. She didn't trust digital. That's very her, it is. A brief pause. Something in his voice that acknowledged, without sentimentality, that they were talking about a person who was gone. There's something else I should tell you. She asked me something, near the end of our last meeting. She asked me whether she should contact you directly with what we'd found. Or wait. What did you tell her? I told her it was her decision. She knew you better than I did. What did she decide? The pause this time was longer. She decided to leave it where you could find it. When you were ready to look. Claire closed her eyes for a moment. The lake outside was doing nothing particular. Flat. Gray still. She thought about Marge sitting in this cottage, 14 months of working with this man, organizing the evidence of something her daughter had refused to see, deciding again and again not to force the information on her, but to put it somewhere. It would be waiting. I need to ask you something directly, she said. Go ahead. What did you find? He told her. She stood at the kitchen window and listened for 12 minutes without sitting down. The account number she'd found in the ledger was registered to a limited liability company Richard had formed in 2014, 1 year before the $47,000 transfer. The company had no website, no public filings beyond the minimum required, and no apparent business purpose that Owen could identify from the records Marge had given him. The loans from Marge, once transferred to that account, had moved again within weeks to an investment account at a brokerage firm. The investments had largely failed. By the time Owen had traced the sequence, as far as he could with the documents available, the original amount was significantly diminished. The $47,000 was gone. Most of the $21,000 was gone. Spent on bad investments, management fees, and what looked like personal expenses run through the business account. Her mother had sent $94,000 into a marriage, and $68,000 of it had ended up in a business entity that Claire had never been told existed, invested in positions that had lost most of their value. And her name was on a loan document she hadn't signed, which meant that if someone looked at that document and decided it was legitimate, she had borrowed $47,000 from a bank and given it to her husband to lose. She was sitting down by the time Owen finished. She didn't remember sitting down. She was just at the table with the ledger in front of her, and the phone pressed hard against her ear. He needed my name on a document, she said. To borrow money, he didn't want me to know he was borrowing. That's my assessment. Yes. And my mother figured this out. She was a meticulous woman, Owen said. She kept records of every financial transaction she was involved in, going back decades. When the repayments didn't come, she started looking more carefully. And the more carefully she looked, the more she found. Did you tell her how serious this was? I did. What was her response? He was quiet for a moment. Then she said she wasn't surprised. She said she'd been afraid of something like this for a long time. And then she asked me what the right way to document it was, so that it would hold up. Claire pressed her fingers against her eyes. Her mother had known, had been afraid of exactly this for a long time, and had not said so because Claire had asked her not to. Because Claire had told her, in this kitchen, in the fall of 2016, that her marriage was fine and please let it be. And Marge, instead of insisting, had done the only thing left available to her. She had kept the record. I need you to meet with me, Claire said. And my attorney. Of course. Whenever you're ready. This week if possible. I can come to Dunmore, he said. It's not a long drive from Grand Rapids. Your mother's house is familiar to me. After she hung up, she sat at the table for a while without doing anything. The fire had gone down to coals again. The cottage was cooling at the edges. Outside, a car passed on the lake road, and the sound of it seemed very loud in the quiet, and then faded completely. She thought about Richard in this house. Not the Richard she'd been angry at for the last 8 months. Not the Richard of the courtroom. The earlier Richard. The one she'd married in a small ceremony in September of 2012, with her mother sitting in the second row, in a blue dress, looking at the man Claire was marrying with an expression Claire had interpreted at the time as approval, and was now sitting in her dead mother's kitchen with a forged bank document in front of her, less certain about. He had not been outwardly cruel. She wanted to be precise about this. There had been no shouting, no dramatic moments of control that she could point to and say, there, that was when it started. It had been slower than that, more incremental. The way a room gets colder when you turn the thermostat down 1 degree at a time. Eventually you're cold, but you can't say exactly when it happened, because each individual adjustment seemed reasonable. The money in the joint account was technically shared, but he managed it. Made sense, he said. He was good at it, he said. She was better at other things, he said. And she had believed him because she wasn't good at it, or hadn't thought she was, because he had spent 4 years gently establishing that she wasn't particularly, and she'd internalized the establishment. The consulting work was separate because of liability. Made sense. She didn't need to worry about it. Okay, fine. Her mother's loans were gifts. That's what he'd said. Marge had offered. Claire had asked Marge, and Marge had said yes. Of course it's a gift, don't be silly. And Claire had believed her because she wanted to believe her, and because Marge had said it in a way that Claire had understood as the end of the conversation. But Marge had written loan in the ledger, with terms, with expected repayments. And when the repayments didn't come, she'd written asking, told everything is fine, and kept the record. Kept it for years. Left it in a chest under a false panel behind a locked drawer in a hidden compartment in a house she'd known her daughter would eventually return to, because she'd believed Claire would come back, even when she had every reason not to. She was still sitting there when Cecile knocked. Not a tentative knock. Cecile knocked the way she did everything, with clear intention. 3 times. Not loud, just clear. Claire opened the door. Cecile stood on the porch, holding a covered dish and wearing her quilted vest over a flannel shirt. She looked at Claire's face and then at the kitchen behind her, and then back at Claire's face. You haven't eaten, she said. I had crackers. That's not eating. She came inside without being invited and set the dish on the counter. Chicken and something. It smelled like what food is supposed to smell like. Claire hadn't noticed she was hungry until that moment. They ate at the kitchen table without discussing what Claire had found in the ledger. Not because Cecile was incurious. Because she was the kind of person who understood the difference between what she needed to know and what she had a right to know. But after the plates were cleared, Cecile set her coffee mug down and looked across the table and said, "How bad is it?" And Claire looked back at her and said, "He borrowed money using my name. Without telling me." Cecile didn't react visibly, which was its own kind of reaction. And my mother knew, Claire said, or suspected, and hired someone to help her document it. The auditor. Owen Pratt, yes. Cecile nodded once, slowly. She never told me what she was working on. She just said she was handling something important and that it needed to be done properly. A pause. She was very particular about doing things properly. She was. Another silence. He came here looking for this, Claire said. Richard. That's what the cardboard box was. Probably the visible papers, the surface things. He didn't find the ledger. No, Cecile said, because she hid it well. She looked at the cedar chest key, still sitting on the table where Claire had left it, and because she didn't think you'd need it right away. She thought you'd come back on your own timeline and find it when you were ready. She thought I'd come back, Claire said, even after everything. Cecile picked up her mug. She didn't doubt that part. She doubted everything else. Whether she'd handled it right, whether she should have pushed harder earlier, whether hiding the evidence and hoping you'd find it was wisdom or cowardice. She drank her coffee, She went back and forth on that until very close to the end. Claire looked at the ledger sitting on the table. What did she decide? She decided, Cecile said carefully, that she was too close to it, that she couldn't trust herself to know the right thing because she was afraid of losing you if she pushed too hard. So she trusted the evidence instead. Let it speak for itself. That sounds very her, it does. A long pause. Claire, there's something else I haven't told you. Claire looked up. Cecile's hands were flat on the table. Her expression was the expression of someone delivering information they've been holding for a while and have made a decision to set down. About 2 months before your mother died, she said. Richard came a second time. The kitchen went still. Not the time with the cardboard box, earlier. He came alone. Didn't bring anything. He was inside for about an hour. She paused. When he left, he stopped in the driveway and looked back at the house. Not the way you look at a house you're leaving. The way you look at something you're thinking about. Did my mother say anything? She called me that evening. She was calm. Very calm. She said Richard had come to speak with her. She said he'd brought an envelope. Cecile paused. She didn't tell me how much was in it, but she said it was a significant amount. In cash. Something cold moved through Claire's chest. He brought her cash. He said it was to help with her medical expenses. As a gesture of goodwill from the family. Cecile's voice was neutral in the way that neutral can mean many things. Your mother thanked him. Very politely. She told him she would put it toward her care. Did she? No. She called her attorney in Ferris Mills the next morning. I drove her. She turned over everything she'd received with a written description of the conversation, to be held in the file as documentation. Cecile looked at Claire directly. She said, "Tell them it's evidence, not a gift." Claire looked at the table. Not a gift. Evidence. Her mother had been handed a bribe by the man who had forged her daughter's signature and looted her daughter's marriage, and Marge Calloway had taken it, counted it, written it up, and turned it over to an attorney the next morning without spending $1 of it. He thought he was buying her silence, Claire said. Yes. Instead, he bought himself a criminal record. Cecile said nothing. But something in her face settled, the way a face settles, when it's been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally set it down somewhere stable. Why didn't you tell me this before? Claire said. Because I needed to know whether you'd come back here to run away from something or to stand and face it. The two situations required different information. She looked at Claire without apology. Now I know. Claire opened her mouth, closed it. She wanted to be annoyed. She'd had the right to know this from the moment she arrived. She could make that argument. It was a good argument. Except, Cecile was 72 years old and had spent 28 years as secretary to county clerks and had watched more people handle bad news than most people meet in a lifetime. And she had looked at Claire when she first came to the door yesterday morning and had made a calculation that turned out to be correct. You couldn't really argue with that. Adrienne needs to know about the cash payment, Claire said. I know. I have the date of the visit, and I kept a note of the conversation I had with your mother that evening. I can send it to you. Thank you. Cecile stood and picked up her mug and carried it to the sink. She washed it and set it on the drying rack and turned around. Your mother told me once, she said, that the worst thing she ever did was teach you that being easy to get along with was a virtue. Claire looked at her. She meant it as an apology, Cecile said. Not to me. She was practicing how to say it to you. The room was quiet for a long moment. She never got the chance, Claire said. No. Cecile picked up her coat from the hook by the door. But you got the ledger. After Cecile left, Claire sat at the kitchen table until the light outside changed. Late afternoon now. The lake going that darker blue it goes when the sun drops behind the pines. She thought about the tax notice. Still sitting on the desk. The 30-day deadline. She thought about $423 in her checking account, and $94,000 her mother had sent into a marriage that had used it as raw material for a business entity Claire hadn't known existed. She thought about the ledger. She opened it to page 1. She turned to the page where Owen Pratt's name appeared in the margin. She turned to the page with the account number. She turned to the pages she'd read 3 times already. Then she turned to the very last entry. She'd noticed it the first night but hadn't absorbed it. It was dated 6 weeks before Marge died. The handwriting was different from the rest. Smaller. the letters uneven in a way the earlier entries weren't. The hand of someone who was tired. It said, "I hope she doesn't have to use this. I hope whatever is broken between them heals on its own. But I have learned in my life that hope is not the same as a plan. This is the plan. This is the plan." Marge Calloway had kept records for 14 months and hidden a ledger and hired an auditor and turned over a bribe to an attorney and arranged for 2 sentences on a piece of paper in a hidden drawer so that if her daughter ever came back, she would know where to start. Because she had known Claire would need a plan. Because hope wasn't going to be enough. Claire closed the ledger. She picked up her phone and called Adrienne. "I need you to file the discovery motion," she said. "As soon as you can." "Already drafted," Adrienne said. "I was waiting for your call. And I have something else." Richard made a cash payment to my mother approximately 2 months before she died. She documented it and turned it over to a local attorney as evidence. "I need that documentation." A pause. Adrienne's pauses were never empty. They were calculating. "Claire," she said, "do you understand what you're building here?" "Yes. This isn't just about correcting the settlement. We are potentially looking at fraud, forgery, and now what sounds like an attempted suppression of a material witness. This gets significantly more serious." "I know. Are you prepared for that?" Outside, the lake was going dark. The pine trees on the far shore were silhouettes. The mergansers she'd seen that morning were gone. The yellow curtains her mother had sewn in 1987 glowed in the light above the kitchen sink. "Yes," Claire said. And for the first time since she'd pulled off the highway 16 hours ago, with 423, and a manila envelope and 6 hours of silence behind her, she meant it without reservation. Owen Pratt drove a gray sedan with a dent in the front passenger panel. Claire saw it from the kitchen window before she heard the engine cut. She recognized the car before she recognized the man. Cecile had described it well. The dent was larger than she'd imagined. The kind that happens when someone has stopped caring about the appearance of things and started caring only about whether they get where they're going. He was 67, maybe 68. Medium height. A gray wool coat that had been good quality once and was still serviceable. He walked up the porch steps with the deliberate pace of a man who had learned a long time ago that hurrying rarely improved an outcome. She opened the door before he knocked. They looked at each other for a moment. "Miss Ashford," he said. "Mr. Pratt." "Owen is fine, Claire." He came inside and she took his coat and hung it on the hook next to Marge's cardigan. And she noticed him notice the cardigan. Just a flicker. The kind of recognition that passes across a person's face when they see something that places them back in a specific time. He had been here before. He knew this hook. He had probably stood in this kitchen. She made coffee, real coffee. She'd driven to the grocery store in Ferris Mills the day before and bought actual groceries, and they sat at the kitchen table with the ledger between them and his briefcase on the floor beside his chair. The briefcase was dark navy, hard-sided old. She didn't mention it. "Adrienne Solt called me yesterday," he said. "She's thorough, she is. She'll do well with what you have." He looked at the ledger. "May I?" Claire slid it across the table. He opened it without ceremony and went directly to a page near the middle, which meant he had been in this ledger before, had his own map of it, knew where the significant entries were. He turned 3 pages forward and stopped. "This account number," he said. "Tell me about it." The LLC was registered in Delaware in March of 2014. One owner, your husband. The registered agent is a service company, the kind that exists specifically so you don't have to put your own address on a filing. He closed the ledger, kept his hands flat on the cover. Delaware LLCs are not required to disclose ownership publicly. Without a court order compelling disclosure, the only way to know who owns it is to get the operating agreement. Adrienne is filing for that. Good. He looked at her steadily. The transfers from your mother's account went in as what appeared to be investment contributions. On her end, they were loans. On the receiving end, they were treated as capital contributions to an investment vehicle. Which means, from the perspective of the LLC's books, she was a passive investor who had voluntarily contributed funds. She didn't know she was contributing to anything. She thought she was lending money to her daughter's household. I know that. You know that. Adrienne knows that. He paused. The LLC's books don't know that. Claire wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. And the loan. The bank loan with my forged signature. That one is more straightforward, which is almost funny. He said, almost funny in a way that made it clear. He didn't find it funny at all. The bank processed a loan application in your name in March 2015. The funds went directly to the LLC account. The monthly payments were made from the joint household account you shared with your husband. He paused. Which means you have been making payments for years on a loan you didn't know you had. The kitchen was very quiet. She had been making the payments without knowing. Because they had a joint account and Richard managed it. And she had been handed a monthly summary that she had reviewed and signed off on, and apparently never noticed a line item for a loan she hadn't taken out. Or she had noticed, and he had explained it as something else. Or he had put it on a page she didn't look at. Or she had looked at it and believed what he told her it was. She couldn't remember. That was the worst part. She genuinely could not reconstruct whether she had or hadn't, because the entire texture of her financial life in that marriage had been a controlled release of information, and she had internalized the control so completely that she couldn't now tell the difference between what she had known and what she had been told she knew. "There's more," Owen said. "Of course there was. When I was working with your mother, she gave me copies of 3 other documents she'd come across. She'd found them in the house in Ann Arbor during a visit in the spring of 2019. She was looking for a pen in your husband's study, and she found copies in the unlocked drawer. He didn't know she'd seen them. I don't believe so. She photographed them with her phone. She didn't move them." He reached down to the briefcase and opened the clasp and took out a folder, placed it on the table. Didn't open it. 3 documents. The first is a liability waiver related to the investment account. Your name appears on it. Your signature appears on it. Claire did not look at the folder. The second is an amendment to a life insurance policy. The original policy, which you both took out in 2013, named each of you as beneficiary for the other. The amendment, dated 2017, changes the beneficiary on his policy to the LLC, not to you, to the business entity. She looked at him. If he had died after 2017, Owen said carefully, the life insurance payout would have gone to the LLC, not to you. And if I had died, he held her gaze. The third document is an amendment to your policy, dated 2018, also changing the beneficiary to the LLC, to the LLC. She set her coffee mug down very slowly on the table, put both hands in her lap, looked at the window. Outside, the lake was doing what the lake always did. Being there, being gray, being permanent in a way that nothing inside this house had turned out to be. She had been paying for a loan she hadn't signed. Her life insurance benefit had been redirected to a company she didn't know existed. Her mother had sent $94,000 into a structure designed to make it disappear. And she had been making coffee in Ann Arbor every morning for years. "I want to be very precise about something," she said. "My signature appears on all 3 of these additional documents." "Yes, and the signature on the bank loan has been assessed by your analysis as inconsistent with my actual signature." "Yes, though formal forensic confirmation requires a certified document examiner, which Adrienne will need to arrange." "Do you believe the signatures on the other 3 documents are also not mine?" He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is professional caution in action. "I believe," he said, "that the same person signed all 4 documents." She understood what he was not quite saying. She nodded. "Once." "Okay," she said. He opened the folder and spread the 3 documents on the table beside the ledger, and she looked at all of it for the first time. Not just what she'd found herself. The whole picture her mother had assembled over 14 months with this methodical man and his hard-sided briefcase and his 22 years at the IRS. The whole thing. It was not dramatic looking. That was what struck her. 4 documents and a ledger. Numbers and dates and signatures. The record of a decade of incremental decisions that had added up, 1 degree at a time, to something that had no good name except fraud. She had been married to it. She had made coffee inside it every morning. She had told her mother it was fine. Something very old and very heavy began to move in her chest. Not grief exactly. Not anger exactly. Something older than both. The feeling of a person who has been in a room without windows for so long they forgot windows existed and has just walked outside for the first time, and the light is too much and too honest and too revealing all at once. She excused herself and went upstairs. She stood in the small bedroom that had been hers growing up and put both hands on the windowsill and looked at the lake and breathed. She gave herself 5 minutes. Then she went back downstairs. Owen had not moved. He was sitting with his coffee and the documents in front of him, and he looked at her when she came back in, with the expression of someone who has delivered bad news before and knows that the aftermath takes different shapes in different people and has learned not to predict which shape it will take. The hearing is in 9 days, she said. I know. Adrienne told me. Will you testify? I will. Adrienne has already sent the engagement letter. He closed the folder. I also have the documentation of the cash payment to your mother. The attorney in Ferris Mills, a woman named Sandra Geyer, has been holding it since the day your mother brought it in. She called me after Adrienne reached out. She's prepared to release it to Adrienne's office. Good. Claire. He paused. Your mother was very specific about one thing. She wanted the record to be complete, but she did not want you to go into whatever came next believing it was about winning. She was afraid the anger would drive you somewhere that wouldn't serve you in the long run. She looked at him. She asked me, he said, to tell you that when I gave you this. She said, make sure she understands it's not about punishing him. It's about making sure she doesn't spend the next decade paying for things she didn't do. The kitchen was quiet. She thought about her mother sitting at this table, drafting that message with this man. Figuring out how to communicate to a daughter she couldn't quite reach the thing she most needed her to understand. She knew me pretty well, Claire said. She did. He stood and picked up the folder. I'll leave you copies of everything I brought. The originals are already with Adrienne. I'll see you at the preliminary hearings next week. He put on his coat at the door, glanced once more at Marge's cardigan on the hook. She used to make terrible coffee, he said. She apologized for it every time. She bought the cheapest brand. She always had. I know. I brought my own after the second visit. He said it without sentimentality. Just a fact about a woman who was gone and who had bought cheap coffee and organized evidence with meticulous care and loved her daughter through 16 months of distance and had made a plan for the eventuality that her daughter would need one. He left. Claire stood at the kitchen window and watched the gray sedan back out of the drive and go down the lake road and disappear into the pines. Then she turned around and looked at the cedar chest key on the kitchen table. She had gone through the chest once. She had found the ledger and the documents folded inside the back cover and the small photo album and the letters in rubber bands. She had taken what she thought was the significant thing and closed the lid. But she hadn't gone through everything. She went upstairs. The chest sat at the foot of the bed where it had always sat. She unlocked it and opened it, and this time she went slowly. The blue wool sweater she didn't recognize she set aside. The photo album she put on the bed. The box of Christmas cards in their rubber band. Her father's box, which she had not opened because it was her father's box, and she was not ready for that. The bundle of letters in rubber bands. She lifted them out. There were 12 letters in the bundle, all in envelopes. All sealed, all addressed in Marge's handwriting. They were not addressed to anyone. Just the date written in the upper right corner where a return address would go. Not an address, a date. The earliest was from 2016. The latest was 6 weeks before Marge died. She sat on the edge of the bed and held them for a moment. They were not for Owen, not for Cecile, not for any attorney or accountant. The envelopes were never stamped, never mailed. She opened the earliest one. Marge had written it in October of 2016, the month after Claire had come up for a weekend, and they'd sat in this kitchen, and Marge had asked the question Claire hadn't wanted to hear, and Claire had told her to let it be. The letter was 3 pages. Her mother's handwriting, familiar and slightly too pressed, filling the pages with something that was not quite diary and not quite letter. Something in between. She wrote about the weekend visit. About watching Claire move through the cottage, the way someone moves through a space they're trying to get through rather than be in. About the way Claire had started a sentence twice at dinner and stopped both times. About the drive to the grocery store where Claire had asked Marge to turn the radio off and then apologized immediately and said she had a headache. She didn't think it was a headache, Marge wrote. She thought it was the particular kind of silence that settles into a person when they've been trying very hard for a long time to seem like they're fine. She recognized it because she had carried that silence herself for the first 15 years of her own marriage. Claire stopped reading. She read that last line again. The first 15 years of her own marriage. Her parents had been married for 38 years before her father died. She had grown up in that marriage. She had thought she knew it. She had thought it was a good one. Her father was a decent man, a quiet man. A man who worked and came home and read the paper and fixed things around the house and didn't make much noise about anything. She had thought that was just how he was. She kept reading. Marge wrote about it plainly, not dramatically. The way she wrote everything, with the kind of honesty that doesn't perform itself. She wrote about learning early in her marriage that it was easier to agree than to push back. That disagreement cost something and agreement was free, and she was practical enough to choose the cheaper option, year after year, until choosing the cheaper option was not a choice anymore, but a reflex. Until she had built a life inside the perimeter of another person's comfort, and called it contentment because she didn't have a better word for it. She wrote, "I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. Your father was not a cruel man. But I made myself very small inside that marriage. And I didn't know I'd done it until you were grown, and I watched you do the same thing, and I thought, oh, I see, I taught her this, I see. I taught her this." Claire put the letter down on the bed. She sat very still. The room was the room it had always been. The same furniture, the same curtains, white ones in here, plain. The same small framed print of Lake Michigan in summer that had hung on that wall since 1989. Everything the same. And she was sitting in it, understanding something she hadn't understood 10 minutes ago. Her mother had not been watching her marriage from the outside. She had been watching it from the inside of a mirror, seeing a reflection of something she recognized because she had lived it. And instead of saying, "Claire, you are doing what I did," which would have been true but would have been the thing Claire rejected in the fall of 2016, she had done the only other thing available to her. She had kept a record. She had hired someone to help her understand what the record meant. She had turned evidence over to an attorney. And she had written 12 letters over 4 years to a daughter she couldn't quite reach, and she had sealed them and never sent them and kept them at the bottom of a chest, because she had not wanted to force what couldn't be forced. She had waited, and she had died waiting. And Claire had come back too late to hear any of it from her mother's own voice, and had to receive it like this, alone in the bedroom, reading letters that were never supposed to be letters, were supposed to be conversations, were supposed to be the thing they said to each other when Claire finally came home. She cried then. Not the careful crying she'd done at the courthouse. Not the suppressed kind where you press your fingers to your eyes and manage it. The kind that happens when something you've been holding for a very long time finally gets too heavy and you set it down all at once. She sat on the edge of her dead mother's bed and cried until the light outside had changed and her throat hurt, and the pillow beside her had a wet patch the size of her palm. Then she washed her face in the bathroom, went downstairs, made more coffee. She read the rest of the letters that evening, all 12, in chronological order, each one a record of what Marge had seen and what she'd felt and what she'd decided not to say and why. The anger was in there. Several letters, especially from 2019 and 2020, contained a kind of controlled fury that didn't make it into the ledger's margins. A fury not at Richard but at the situation, at the way the situation had been allowed to calcify, at herself, as much as anyone. One letter from the spring of 2020 said, "I keep thinking I should have been louder. And then I think, I was loud enough once and she shut the door. And I think, maybe I should have knocked again anyway. I don't know what the right answer is. I don't know if there is one. I just know that being quiet didn't fix it and being loud didn't fix it. And I'm running out of ways to try. I'm running out of ways to try." Written 18 months before she died. Claire folded the letters back into their envelopes, put the rubber band around them, put them in her coat pocket. Then she sat at the kitchen table and looked at the yellow curtains. She understood something now that she hadn't understood when she arrived 3 days ago. She had come back here thinking she was retreating, thinking 423 and a failed marriage and a contempt notice from the county tax office added up to the end of something, the bottom of something. But her mother had not built this, the hidden ledger and the 12 letters and the methodical documentation and the plan as a monument to defeat. She had built it as the opposite of that. She had built it for the contingency that her daughter would need it, which meant she had believed, even in the last months, that her daughter would be the kind of person who could use it. She had believed Claire was that person, even when Claire couldn't see it herself. She went to the desk and found a notepad and sat down and made a list. Not a feelings list, a things list, the kind her mother would have made. Call Adrienne. Confirm hearing date. Confirm Owen's testimony schedule. Contact Sandra Geyer in Ferris Mills Re. Documentation of cash payment. Property tax payment arrangement by end of week. Grocery run Thursday. She looked at the list, added one more line at the bottom. Read the rest of the letters. The following morning she was at the kitchen table by 7 with the letters and the legal pad when Cecile knocked. She came in without being asked, poured herself coffee and sat down. She saw the letters. She didn't say anything about them. The preliminary hearing, she said instead. Next week. Thursday. How are you feeling about it? Claire considered the question honestly. I don't know yet. Adrienne says the documents are strong, but the timeline is tight. The forensic document examiner won't have a full report until after the hearing. We're going in with Owen's analysis and the ledger and the cash payment documentation. Is that enough? Adrienne thinks it's enough to reopen the settlement question. To get the judge to agree that the original judgment was based on incomplete financial disclosure. She paused. Whether it's enough to do more than that depends on what Richard does when he realizes what we have. What do you think he'll do? She thought about Richard in the parking lot after the courthouse that August morning. His pressed shirt, his calm, the way he had looked at her with an expression that she had read at the time as pity and now read differently, the way a person looks at a situation they believe they still control. I think he'll deny everything, she said, because that's what he's been doing for 11 years and it's worked. And this time he won't be the only one in the room who knows what the documents say. Cecile drank her coffee. Good. They sat quietly for a few minutes. Then Cecile said, the paint on the back steps is peeling. Claire blinked. What? The back steps. The paint is peeling badly. It's going to be a problem come spring when the wood starts taking moisture. I know. I've been meaning to. I have paint in my garage. Green, which is not what you'd choose probably, but it's what I have. And it's exterior grade and it'll last. Cecile, I don't need to paint the steps right now. You need to do something with your hands before that hearing, or you'll lose your mind. She stood up. I'll bring the paint in an hour. She brought the paint in an hour. 2 cans of it, dark green. The kind of green that is almost black in low light, which was not what Claire would have chosen. But Cecile had been right, that it didn't matter. They worked outside in the cold afternoon light. Claire with the brush and Cecile with the roller for the flat surfaces. The steps were 6 of them. Old wood, weathered to silver gray. The green went on thick and even. They didn't talk about the hearing. They didn't talk about Richard or the ledger or Owen Pratt or what came next. They talked about the steps and the weather and the merganser ducks that kept appearing and disappearing on the water. At some point, Cecile said, your mother repainted these steps every other year. I know. She used red until around 2005. Then she switched to gray. She told me she switched to gray because it was on sale. That also sounds right. They painted until the light went, and then they stood back and looked at the steps in the near dark, and the green was very green, almost aggressively green. It's a lot, Claire said. It'll tone down when it dries. Will it? Probably not. Claire looked at the steps, then at Cecile, then at the steps again. She laughed. Actually laughed, not the careful kind. The kind that comes from somewhere genuine and surprised. Cecile made a sound that was, for Cecile, the equivalent of laughing. Your mother would have hated it, Cecile said. She would have repainted them within the week. She would have repainted them and not said anything about it, and you would have noticed, and she would have said, I just thought it needed freshening. They stood there in the cold with paint on their hands and the smell of fresh exterior paint in the air, and the lake making its sounds and the cottage behind them warm and lit from inside. She had been in this house for 5 days. When she arrived, she had 423 and a tax notice, and the feeling of someone who has walked into a room to find all the furniture rearranged and can't quite remember where anything used to be. She still had the tax notice. Adrienne had called about a payment arrangement, and Claire had set up the first installment from the editing contract she'd signed 2 days earlier. A publishing company in Chicago. 3 months of copy editing. It wasn't enough to fix everything. It was enough to fix this week. The furniture was still rearranged, but she was beginning to remember where some of it used to go. And she was beginning to understand, in the specific way you understand things when you're sitting in a cold cottage, reading your dead mother's unsent letters, that the version of herself who had made coffee in Ann Arbor every morning for 11 years was not the only version, was not even the original version, was just the version that had been most convenient for the life she'd been living inside. There was a version of her that her mother had believed in, had kept records for, had written 12 letters to. She didn't know yet if she was that version, but she thought she might be getting closer. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened the folder Owen had left. She spread the documents across the table, the ledger, the photocopied loan agreement, the 3 additional documents Owen had brought, the pages and pages of Adrienne's analysis. Then she picked up the phone and called Adrienne. "I want to go through everything once more," she said. "Before Thursday. I want to know every document, every date, every number cold." "That's good," Adrienne said. "That's exactly right. I don't want to walk in there knowing some of it. I want to walk in there knowing all of it." "Then let's start now." They went through it for 2.5 hours. By the end, Claire could have recited the account number, the loan dates, the transfer amounts, and the discrepancies in each of the 4 forged documents without looking at a single page, because that was the thing about evidence. It didn't speak for itself. Someone had to know it well enough to make it speak. Her mother had known that, had spent 14 months making sure the evidence was there to be known. Now it was Claire's turn to know it. She hung up at 11 and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of the cottage. The ledger was in front of her. She turned to the last page, her mother's last entry, the handwriting unsteady, the letters pressed too hard as always, even at the end, even when the hand behind them was tired. "This is the plan." She put her palm flat on the page. She had come here with nothing. Nothing except the address, which was her mother's address, which her mother had kept in her name, which was the one thing Richard had not gotten to. She had the address. She had the ledger. She had 12 letters she hadn't been able to receive until now, and on Thursday she was going to walk into a courtroom with all of it, and she was going to let the documents speak, and she was going to be the person who knew them cold. Not because she wanted to win, because she needed to stop paying for things she hadn't done, because her mother had believed she was the kind of person who could, because she was, finally, starting to believe it too. The courthouse in Ferris Mills was not a dramatic building. 2 stories of pale brick. A parking lot that needed resurfacing. Glass doors that stuck when the temperature dropped below freezing, which in December in Michigan meant they stuck most of the time. Claire had driven past the entrance twice before she found the turn. She sat in the car after she cut the engine and looked at the building through the windshield. Not because she was afraid, because she had learned, in the last 10 days, that there was a difference between being ready and being settled. She was ready. She needed 30 more seconds to be settled. She counted them. Then she got out. Adrienne was in the lobby, dark blazer, reading glasses pushed up on her head, the contained energy of someone who had done this enough times to know that performance was wasted, and preparation was everything. She looked at Claire the way she always looked at her before a hearing. Not reassuring. Assessing. "How are you?" "I know it cold," Claire said. Adrienne nodded. That was the right answer, and they both knew it. Owen was already in the corridor outside the courtroom. Gray wool coat, briefcase under his arm. He looked exactly like a man who had spent 22 years at the IRS and had stopped being surprised by anything a financial document could contain. He looked at Claire once and gave a single nod. She nodded back. That was enough. Richard arrived 6 minutes before the hearing began. She heard him first, the particular sound of his shoes on tile. Hard soles, deliberate pace. She had organized her mornings around that sound for 11 years. put the coffee mug on the counter at the exact moment she heard it stop at the kitchen doorway. She did not do that anymore. He came around the corner with his attorney, a man named Garrett Fuller, who had the tight, managed smile of someone who had reviewed the initial filing and concluded he had the stronger position. Richard wore a charcoal suit. His hair was the same. His face was the same. He looked at her with the expression she had last seen across a courtroom in August, the expression that said, "I know something you don't." He had always had that expression, even in the early years, when she had read it as confidence and found it attractive. The expression of a man who believed the room was with him. She looked back at him without blinking, and without smiling, and without looking away. He was the first one to look somewhere else. So that was already different. The courtroom was plain and functional, the kind of county courtroom that makes no claims about itself. Judge Weston was a woman in her late 50s with reading glasses on a chain and the manner of someone who had heard every variety of financial dispute a marriage could generate and had developed a precision instrument for separating what mattered from what was noise. Adrienne presented first. She was methodical. No drama. No rhetorical flourishes. She laid out the timeline the way evidence is supposed to be laid out, in order, starting with the earliest loan in 2012 and moving forward through each transaction, placing a document in front of the judge at each step, the account number, the LLC registration date, the transfer records, the payment history, then the loan. She placed the photocopy on the table, the one with Claire's name in the signature line. Fuller leaned over, said something in Richard's ear. Richard's face did not change, but something behind his face changed, something in the jaw. The particular stillness of a man who has just understood that the room knows more than he expected. Adrienne said, "The plaintiff has retained a certified document examiner, whose report, filed this morning, concludes with a probability exceeding 94% that the signature on this document is not that of Claire Ashford. 94%, not a suspicion, a number." The judge looked at the document, then at Adrienne. "Counsel, are you filing a fraud claim?" "We are filing a motion to vacate the original settlement on grounds of material financial misrepresentation and a concurrent fraud claim. We are also presenting 3 additional documents bearing what we believe to be the same fraudulent signature." She placed them on the table, the liability waiver, the first insurance amendment, the second. The judge looked at each one. Fuller stood. "Your Honor, my client categorically denies any misrepresentation." The documents in question were standard financial instruments executed in the normal course of the marriage's business activities, and both parties were aware of the arrangements. The judge looked at him. Both parties were aware. "Yes, Your Honor. Then the defendant will have no difficulty explaining the account to which these funds were transferred, an account that does not appear on any financial disclosure filed during the original proceeding." A pause. Short. But in a courtroom, short pauses have weight. Fuller said, "My client will provide full account documentation when we would request 60 days to counsel." The judge's voice did not rise. It didn't need to. This account received marital funds and was not disclosed. "I'm granting a 14-day production order. Not 60. 14. She made a note. "I'd like to hear from the defendant." Richard stood. He was good at standing. He had always been good at the posture of a man who believes the room is with him. Shoulders back, chin level, the bearing of someone who has spent a long time being the person who knows things and has come to mistake that position for permanence. The judge looked at him over her reading glasses. "Mr. Ashford, the account ending in these digits." She read them from the document in front of her. "Were you aware of this account during the marriage?" "The account was related to my consulting activities," Richard said, "separate from the marital estate." "Were you aware of it?" "Yes." "Was your wife aware of it?" A pause. The smallest pause. Barely a second. But she had sat across from him for 11 years and she knew every pause he made, and this one was the pause of a man choosing his next sentence very carefully. "She was aware of my consulting work." "That is not what I asked." "Was she aware of this specific account?" "We discussed my consulting arrangements on multiple occasions." The judge set down her pen. "Mr. Ashford, I'm going to ask you one more time, and I need you to answer the question I'm actually asking, not a related question. Was your wife aware of the existence of this specific account? Silence. The silence of a man who has spent 11 years answering the question he wanted to answer instead of the one being asked, and who has just encountered someone who will not move on until the actual question receives an actual answer. I believe she was generally aware, he said. Generally aware. That was what 11 years added up to in this room. Generally aware. Then Adrienne stood and said, "Your Honor, I'd like to enter one additional piece of evidence." She placed a document on the table. Fuller was on his feet before it reached the judge. Objection. The plaintiff did not list this exhibit in the original. It was filed at 7:42 this morning, Adrienne said. Prior to the commencement of this hearing, the defendant had full access to the docket. The judge picked it up. She read it. She read it again. She set it down. She looked at Richard. "This is an email from your address to a private auditing firm in Detroit, Trails." She did not raise her voice. She read from the document with the evenness of someone delivering information that does not require emphasis because the information is sufficient. You ask, and I'm quoting, "If a household financial ledger belonging to a family member were to surface during divorce proceedings, what would be the legal exposure for an individual whose name appeared in it?" She looked up. "You sent this email 5 months before the original divorce judgment." The courtroom was quiet. Not dramatically quiet. The quiet of a room in which something has become clear, and everyone in it is aware that it has become clear. "You wrote this email," the judge said. Not a question. Richard's jaw moved. Fuller touched his arm. Richard said, "I was conducting due diligence related to. You told this court 5 minutes ago that you were unaware of any documents that would complicate the financial picture of your marriage." The judge's voice remained level, precise, which made it more authoritative, not less. "This email demonstrates that 5 months before judgment, you were aware of the potential existence of exactly such a document and were seeking professional advice on your legal exposure." "Your Honor," Fuller said. "Sit down, counsel." Fuller sat down. Richard stood there. He looked, for the first time in the 11 years she had known him, like a man who did not know what the room was going to do next. Like a man who had spent so long being the person who controlled the information that the experience of standing in a room where someone else held it had become unfamiliar. She watched him from across the room and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more complicated than either. The particular feeling of a person who has been carrying a version of a story for a very long time and has just watched another version of it enter a room that could see it clearly. Her mother had seen it clearly for years. Now the room could too. Adrienne called Owen to the stand. He testified for 38 minutes. He did not raise his voice. He did not use words that required explanation. He said account number and transfer date and balance and discrepancy, and he said them with the flat authority of a man who had spent 22 years examining exactly this kind of record and knew what he was looking at and would say so without qualification. When Fuller cross-examined him, he answered every question with the same measured evenness. He did not elaborate beyond what was asked. He did not hedge. He did not perform certainty because he didn't need to perform it. The numbers said what they said. Then Adrienne called Claire. She walked to the stand, sat down, looked at the room, Adrienne at the table, Owen beside her, the judge with her reading glasses and her precise expression, Richard and Fuller at the other table, Richard's face now arranged into the controlled neutral of a man who has decided that controlled neutral is his best remaining option. She had seen that face before, across the dinner table, across the kitchen, in the car on long drives when she said something he disagreed with, and he chose not to argue and chose instead to simply wait for her to stop talking. She knew what was behind it. "Ms. Ashford," Adrienne said, "in the course of your marriage, were you given access to the account ending in these digits?" "No." "Were you aware this account existed?" "No." "Were you ever presented with a loan document from First Michigan Bank for the amount of $47,000 and asked to sign it?" "No." "Is the signature on Exhibit C your signature?" Claire looked at the document, at the line where her name was printed and someone else's version of it appeared above. "No," she said. "It isn't." "How do you know?" She said it simply. "Not as a trap, as an invitation. Because I sign my name the same way I have since college." The C is rounded at the top and comes down without lifting the pen. The D at the end of Ashford has a small tail that turns back under the letter. Neither of those things appears in that signature. She paused. I've written my name the same way for 44 years. I know what it looks like. Fuller was preparing an objection. Judge Weston said noted. Continue. They went through the insurance documents. Same questions, same answers, same even voice. Not performing steadiness. Just steady, because she had sat at her dead mother's kitchen table for 9 days and read these documents until they were part of her. And now she was in the room the plan had been made for, and the plan was working, and her job was to let it work. Fuller got his cross-examination. He had messages. She had expected this. Printed emails from the last year of the marriage. He read from them with the particular intonation that gives words a meaning slightly adjacent to their actual meaning. He read, I can't keep doing this. He read, sometimes I wonder if any of it was real. He read, I'm so tired of feeling like I'm invisible. Then he set the pages down and looked at her. Miss Ashford, were you struggling during the marriage? Yes. Were there times when you felt overwhelmed? Yes. Were there times when you disengaged from the day-to-day financial management of your household? She looked at him, not at the pages, not at Richard, at Fuller, who was asking the question he had been paid to ask. Mr. Fuller, she said, I disengaged from our household finances because my husband told me over many years that I wasn't good at it, that he was better at it, that it was more efficient for him to handle it, that I should focus on other things. She paused. I believed him. Because I was inside the situation and I couldn't see it, and because he was very good at presenting things one piece at a time in a way that seemed reasonable until you looked at all the pieces together. Fuller said, so you're saying? I'm saying that being told you're not capable of something until you stop trying to be capable of it is not the same as choosing not to engage. Those are different things. She held his gaze. I think you know the difference. The courtroom was quiet again. Fuller looked at his papers, no further questions. The judge looked at Claire, not with warmth, with something more useful than warmth. The look of someone who has heard a great many people speak in this room and can tell the difference between a person performing honesty and a person simply being honest. Miss Ashford, you may step down. She stepped down, walked back to the table, sat next to Adrienne, put her hands in her lap, looked at the surface of the table in front of her. Adrienne's hand covered hers for 1 second. Then the world continued. The judge recessed for 40 minutes. Claire sat in the corridor on a wooden bench and did not talk. Adrienne brought coffee from a machine down the hall, and it was machine coffee, which meant it was hot and something to hold, and those were the two things it needed to be. Owen sat beside her and read something on his phone. He did not offer reassurance. She was grateful for that. Reassurance before a verdict is just noise. She thought about the email. Richard sending a message to a private auditing firm in Detroit 5 months before judgment, asking about legal exposure if a household financial ledger were to surface. He had been afraid. He had come to the cottage and searched and found nothing, and gone home and sent that email because the fear hadn't left with him. She thought about something Owen had shown her without saying directly. A man careful enough to build this structure would also be careful enough to ask questions before it collapsed. Careful people leave paper trails. Even when they're trying not to, he had been afraid of exactly this room. And he had not been afraid enough to stop. Not afraid enough to come clean or return the money or correct the documents. He had just sent the email and sat in his pressed shirt and waited to see what the room would find. The room had found everything. Judge Weston returned. She had a document in front of her, 3 pages, which she placed on the bench, with the precise movement of someone who has made a decision and is prepared to state it. She said, the original settlement in the matter of Ashford versus Ashford is vacated. She said it the way you say a fact, not announced, just stated. Fuller started to rise. Weston looked at him. He sat back down. She continued. The marital estate would be reconsidered in full. A court-appointed financial auditor would conduct a complete review of all accounts, disclosed and undisclosed, for the duration of the marriage. The 14-day production order for the LLC documentation stood. The fraud claim would proceed on a separate track with a hearing date to be set within 60 days. regarding the Dunmore Lake property, registered in the name of Margaret Calloway, deceased, with Claire Ashford as sole heir. The court noted the defendant had accessed the property after the filing of divorce proceedings, without the plaintiff's knowledge or consent, as documented in the affidavit of neighbor Cecile Hartwood, filed with the morning's supplementary materials. The court noted this. In the language of courtrooms, noted is not a small word. The cash payment of $9,000 delivered to Margaret Calloway by the defendant approximately 2 months before her death, documented by attorney Sandra Geyer of Ferris Mills per the deceased's explicit instructions. The court noted this also. And then, Judge Weston looked up from her document and looked at the room. The original judgment proceeded on the basis that the marital estate had been fully and honestly disclosed. It had not been. This court does not consider itself bound by conclusions it was misled into reaching. She gathered her papers. We're adjourned. The room stood. She left. Claire sat down before she meant to, her body making its own decision about what came next. Not because her legs failed, because the instructions she had been running on for 10 days. Know it cold, hold it together, be the person who can use the plan. Those instructions had just reached their end point, and her body was taking a moment to receive that information. Adrienne sat beside her. Okay, Claire said. Yes, the settlement is vacated. Yes, and the fraud claim proceeds on its own track, which will take time, but we have what we need and more. Adrienne looked at her directly. You knew it cold. The documents knew it cold. You're the one who read them until you did. That's not the same thing. Owen came and shook her hand. Brief, firm, professional. Your mother would have been satisfied, he said. Not proud. Satisfied. The word of a woman who made plans and needed to know whether they worked. Yes, Claire said. I think she would. He put on his coat and picked up his briefcase. At the door he paused once. She bought terrible coffee, he said. She apologized for it every time I visited. She always bought the cheapest brand. I know. I started bringing my own after the second visit. A pause. She never mentioned it. He said it without sentimentality. Just a fact about a woman who was gone and who had kept careful records and bought cheap coffee and had loved her daughter in the particular way of a person who expresses love through preparation rather than declaration. He left. Richard and Fuller had gone through a different exit. She hadn't watched them leave. She had felt the absence in the room shift, the way you feel when a pressure that has been present for a long time is no longer present, and it takes a moment to recognize what the absence means. She thought about Richard's face during the judge's decision, the controlled neutral he had arranged himself into, and beneath it, just barely visible, the face of a man at the end of the version of things he had constructed, looking at a room that knew more than he had thought it would. She tried to feel something clean about it. Victory. Justice. The simple satisfaction of a wrong being corrected. What she felt was more complicated and less dramatic than any of those. The feeling of someone who has been carrying an extra weight for so long that setting it down doesn't feel like relief immediately. It feels like suddenly noticing how tired your arms are. She picked up her bag, walked out through the sticky glass doors into the December afternoon. The parking lot needed resurfacing. The cold was the kind that meant business. She got into her car and sat for a moment and looked through the windshield at the pale brick building, and then she drove north. She stopped at Cecile's on her way through. Cecile was on her porch in her quilted vest, which was either because she had been expecting Claire or because Cecile simply spent her evenings on her porch regardless of the temperature, which was also entirely possible. She looked up when the car turned into the drive. She looked at Claire's face. Well, she said. Vacated, Claire said. The fraud claim proceeds separately. Cecile nodded once, slowly, the nod of a woman who had been holding something steady for a long time and could now set it down. Come in, she said. I made soup. The kitchen smelled like something with thyme in it. Not chicken this time. Something with beans and winter vegetables, the kind of soup that a person makes from what's left in the refrigerator at the end of a long week. And that turns out to be exactly right. They sat at Cecile's kitchen table and ate without discussing the hearing first. Cecile asked her how she was. Claire said tired. Cecile said that was correct. After a while, Claire told her about the hearing in order, the way she had learned to tell things in order, the email, the judge's words about being misled into reaching a conclusion, the production order. The fraud track. Cecile listened without interrupting. When Claire finished, Cecile was quiet for a moment. Sandra Geyer called me this afternoon, she said. She wanted to know how it went. Sandra Geyer, the attorney in Ferris Mills, who had been holding the documentation of Richard's cash payment since the morning Marge had walked into her office and handed it over. Sandra, who had held it for 16 months, without saying a word to anyone except the people Marge had authorized her to speak to. What did you tell her? I told her the judge used the word noted. Cecil looked at her. She understood what that meant. Claire looked at her soup. She did what she was supposed to do, Claire said. Sandra, you Owen. A pause. My mother set up a whole system and everyone in it did exactly what she needed them to do. She was precise about what she needed, Cecile said. She gave very clear instructions. I know. Claire looked up. I was the variable she couldn't control. Cecile put down her spoon. You were the person she trusted most. Those aren't the same thing. No, Cecile said, they're not. But she trusted you anyway, without knowing how it would go. She picked up her spoon again. That's a different kind of trust from the kind that comes with guarantees. They finished eating. Cecile cleared the bowls and came back to the table with an envelope. Small. White. Claire's name on the front in her mother's handwriting. The particular slope of it. The letters pressed harder than they needed to be. She set it on the table between them. She left 3 things with me to hold, Cecile said. You know about the first 2. The letter for Owen and the shed key for the plumber. She looked at the envelope. This one she said to give you after it was finished. She said, not before, not during, after, when she doesn't need it to be brave, when it can just be something she reads. Claire looked at the envelope. When it can just be something she reads. She picked it up. Thank you, she said. For everything, for the whole 10 days. Cecile looked at her. She would have found a way to thank me herself if she'd had more time. I know. Go home, Cecile said. Not unkindly. The way you tell someone to go home when home is where they need to be. Claire drove the 1/4 mile back along the lake road. Parked. Sat for a moment with the envelope on the passenger seat and the engine ticking as it cooled. Then she took the envelope and went inside. The cottage was the cottage. The yellow curtains. The table with the gouge in the corner. The dish towel with the red stripes. The ceramic barn that had never once in Claire's entire memory contained a cookie, and which she had bought a bag of shortbreads for 2 days ago and put inside, because she had decided that 37 years of an empty cookie jar was enough. Marge's cardigan on the hook by the back door. She took it down, put it on. It was still too large, the right elbow still worn through to almost nothing. She had stopped noticing that it was too large. She built a fire in the living room fireplace. Not rushed, methodically, the way her mother had taught her when she was 12 years old. Paper first, then kindling, then the smallest logs, then larger ones once the fire had established itself. You don't rush a fire. You give it what it needs and let it do the work. She sat in the armchair and held the envelope and let the fire get going. Then she opened it. 1 page, front and back. The handwriting different from the 12 letters she had already read. Not working something out. Not drafting. Decided. The handwriting of a person who has thought about something for a long time and is finally saying it the way they mean to say it. Marge had written about herself first. She wrote about being 27 years old and moving into a house with a man she loved and learning very early that the easiest way to keep that love was to be easy. Not dishonest. Not performing. Just easy. Just the kind of woman who let things go. Who chose the cheaper option, year after year, until choosing the cheaper option had stopped being a choice and had become a reflex. Until she had built a life inside the perimeter of another person's comfort and called it contentment because she didn't have a better word. She wrote, I was not unhappy. I want to be clear about that. Your father was not a cruel man. But I made myself very small inside that marriage, and I didn't understand. I had done it until you were grown, and I watched you begin to do the same thing, and I thought, oh, I see. I taught her this. Not on purpose, but I taught her. Claire read it twice, set the page against her chest for a moment. Just a moment. Then she kept reading. Marge wrote about watching Claire grow up, about the woman she had seen Claire becoming in her 20s before Richard. Sharp and funny and sure of herself in the way that young women sometimes are before someone spends enough years telling them that this much sureness is too much. She wrote about the years of the marriage and what she had watched change. Not suddenly. 1 degree at a time. The same way she had changed inside her own marriage, in the same increments for the same reasons, without noticing until it was already done. She wrote, I recognized it because I had lived it. That is the part I could not say to you. Not because I didn't want to, because every time I came close you heard criticism instead of recognition. And I understood why, because I would have heard the same thing at your age. And so I stopped trying to say it the right way and started trying to do the only other thing I knew how to do. I kept the record. I made the plan. I trusted that you would come back and find it. You came back. Claire looked at the fire. The fire was doing what fires do when they are well made. Burning clean, putting out steady heat, not dramatic, just reliable. She kept reading. Marge had written about the last 2 years. About Owen and what he had found. About Richard coming to the cottage with the cash in the paper envelope and the look on his face that told her he was expecting a woman who could be managed, and what he found instead was a woman who had been managing things quietly for 50 years and knew exactly what to do with evidence. She wrote, he thought he was buying my silence. I thought about explaining to him that he had misunderstood the situation entirely. Then I thought, let him misunderstand. And I called Sandra Geyer in the morning. Claire almost laughed. Almost. She turned the page. The last paragraph was written in smaller letters, as though Marge had been running out of space, or energy, or both. The handwriting still pressed too hard. Still the particular slope. Still her mother, to the last letter. She wrote, I don't know what you look like right now, reading this. I don't know what the last 10 days have been like for you. I hope some of it was hard in the way that hard things are sometimes exactly what you need. Hope some of it was easier than you expected. I hope Cecile gave you enough to eat and not too much advice, though I suspect the advice was plentiful and largely correct. I want to tell you one thing and then I am done. You did not learn to make yourself small from a stranger. You learned it from watching me. And I spent 30 years thinking that was simply how things were. And then I spent the last 2 years of my life thinking, what a waste. Not of the marriage, of myself, of you. You are not broken. You have never been broken. You were doing the thing I showed you how to do, and the thing I showed you was wrong, and I am sorry. That is mine to carry, not yours. Start putting things down that don't belong to you. I am so proud of the woman who came back to this house. I love you entirely, even when I couldn't say it exactly right. Mom, the fire, the cardigan, the room where her mother had sat for 38 winters. She sat with the letter in her lap for a long time. Not thinking. Exactly. Not crying, though the back of her throat ached with the specific ache of someone who has finally received something they have needed for a long time, and did not know how to receive until this moment. Her mother had not been able to say it out loud. She had said it in a ledger, and a plan, and a series of letters, and a man named Owen, and a woman named Sandra, and a neighbor named Cecile, who made soup with thyme in it, and gave clear and largely correct advice, and had kept a small white envelope for exactly as long as it needed to be kept. Her mother had said it in every way she knew how, except the way that would have been simplest. And Claire, who had spent 11 years being told she was generally aware of things, while actually knowing nothing, understood now why simple had not been available to her mother. Because the simple version required the other person to be ready to hear it, and Claire had not been ready, had closed the door every time Marge came close, had said I'm fine, thank you, please drop it, and Marge had dropped it, and they had lost years to the dropping of it. She couldn't fix that. She could only be here now, in the armchair, in the cardigan, with the letter, and the fire, and the understanding that had arrived too late and was still, somehow, worth having. She folded the letter back into its envelope, held it. She thought about the 12 letters in the cedar chest upstairs, the ones Marge had written over 4 years and sealed and never sent, all of them working towards something she couldn't quite say directly. And this one, the 13th, the one she had given to Cecile to hold until after, the one where she finally said it. She had gotten there in the end, they both had. Just not at the same time. She set the envelope on the small table beside the armchair. Her mother's reading glasses were still in the table's drawer. which she had not moved or touched. And sometimes when she sat in this chair, she was aware of them there, the way you are aware of things that belong to a person who is no longer present. She was aware of them now. She didn't open the drawer, she sat. The fire burned down slowly, steadily, the way a good fire does when it has what it needs. Outside, the lake was doing what it did at this hour in December, which was nothing in particular, just existing in the dark, the ice beginning at the edges now, but the center still open, still moving in whatever small current ran below the surface, even when everything above it was still. She had not looked at this lake as anything other than her mother's lake for 30 years. The place her mother lived. The place she drove to when obligation required it and left as soon as she reasonably could. The place she had not come back to for 16 months after her mother died, because coming back would have meant arriving at a place where her mother was not, which was a different thing from the usual absence, and she had not been ready for the difference. She was ready now. She thought about the tax notice, still in the desk. The 30-day deadline she had met with the first payment from the editing contract. 3 months of work for a small publishing house in Chicago. Not enough to fix everything. Enough to fix the next thing. Then, the next thing after that. She thought about the fraud claim. The months it would take. The documents the court-appointed auditor would find that she probably hadn't found yet. The things that would still be hard. She thought about starting over at 44 with a cottage before that needed a new roof section and a plumber to see about the pipes before the hard freeze and paint on the back steps that had turned out considerably greener than intended. She thought about Cecile's face when she had said, standing in the parking lot looking at the freshly painted steps, "It'll tone down when it dries." And then 2 days later, with the paint dried and still aggressively, defiantly, almost confrontationally green, probably not. She had laughed. She had covered her mouth and laughed, and Cecile had made the sound that was, for Cecile, the equivalent of laughing, and her mother would have had the steps repainted within the week and would not have said a word about why. This was her life now. The green steps, and the cheap cookie jar, and the coffee she had learned to buy in the right brand, and the fire she knew how to build, and the chair she sat in, and the cardigan that was too large, and the lake that was always there whether she was watching it or not, and her mother's voice, finally, in a letter she could keep. The fire had burned to the point where it needed another log or it would go out. She got up and put one on. Watched it take. Then she went to the kitchen. The yellow curtains, lit from behind by the lamp above the sink. From outside they were probably the warmest thing visible on the lake road in the dark. She put the kettle on. Not because she was particularly thirsty, because it was something to do that was simple and good and belonged entirely to her. The particular small pleasure of deciding to make tea in your own kitchen at 9 o'clock on the night that something finished. She stood at the window while she waited for the water to boil. The lake. She had grown up looking at this lake, and she had spent 20 years away from it, and she had come back 10 days ago with 423 and a tax notice and the feeling of someone who has lost most of the things she thought defined her. And the lake had not cared about any of that, had not noticed her absence, had not adjusted itself to her return. It was just there. The kettle reached its sound. She made the tea, carried it to the living room and sat back in the armchair. The fire, the cardigan, the letter on the small table beside her. She drank her tea and did not think about what came next. Not because she was avoiding it, because for once she didn't have to. Next could wait until morning. Next could be tomorrow's problem, and the day after's problem, and the slow work of whatever came after a thing like this. Tonight she had done what she came to do. The record was corrected. The plan had worked. And her mother had left her a letter that said, "I see you. I always saw you. Put down the things that don't belong to you." She was going to try. Outside, the ice continued its quiet work at the edges of the lake. Inside, the fire held. The yellow curtains were lit. The cottage was warm in the way of a place that has been kept warm by the same hands for decades and has learned to hold heat. She stayed in the chair until the fire needed tending again. Got up, put the last log on, stood for a moment in the warm room, went to the window once more. The lake, the ice, the far tree line dark against the dark sky. She looked at it for a long time. Then she turned off the kitchen light, went to the armchair one more time, picked up her mother's letter, carried it upstairs, set it in the cedar chest on top of the 12 others where it belonged, closed the lid, and slept.